Hello, welcome to the Podin Along podcast with myself, Steve Rastall. I've got a guest today, Ian Pender. Ian's done some really interesting things around legacy in the cloud, and not in your normal sense, more you're already there and getting cloud. You know, cloud's been around 2010, 2008, maybe earlier in some ways. So that legacy is now starting to grow, and I know Ian's had lots of experience and got an interesting story about how you manage those challenges. But it's better Ian explains that. Ian, please introduce yourself.
Hello, Steve. Thanks for inviting me along. I'm Ian Pender, lead principal engineer at Flagstone. Been here about 5.5 years. I've got a 20 years experience prior to that in a range of industries and domains. I was contracting in places like Huddle, RBS, let me think, EasyJet, ASOS, places like that. And yeah, I absolutely love Flagstone. We're building a growing engineering culture, and we've certainly gone through a bit of a journey in the last 18 months.
Well, that's what we'd like to talk about today, because when people say legacy, it's a bit of a dirty word, isn't it, in our space? Like old, problematic, and how you get from one place to another. Could you just frame a little bit for us about the project you've done in the last 18 months and what's been involved, and then we can dig down into that.
And you're absolutely right. I know when I was contracting, easiest thing is to search for a greenfield project, right? Everybody wants one of those. Maintaining, bridging over, making code and systems last longer is absolutely a painful thing. And for us, we were a growing boutique-like startup, which is so hard to grow. We're profitable, but certainly enough startups fail to even reach that stage. But to get there, we had to sacrifice a number of principles along the way and glue together systems just to reach that point. And what we realized is that there comes a point when that is a hamstring. You're hamstrung to your future and your ability to grow. And that's really what kicked off what we called a migration. But it was a far bigger process than that involved a lot of company-wide changes.
So I think one thing I pick up on there, and we've just touched on it earlier slightly, is that what you have to do when you start a business, particularly that's got a tech orientation, and the compromises and constraints you self-impose or get imposed on you from time, budget, and all a host of other things, often then creates these legacy or pains that have to be dealt with down the road. So just give us a bit of what was that, and then what challenges? The business grew and those pains grew, and how did that start being that you then had to treat this as a project to take things forward? What was the drivers that kicked things off?
I think the wisest statements I hear from people who come in to new jobs and get a new kind of leadership role is that they just listen and look for 3 to 6 months. And of course, you've got to have the luxury where things not needing immediate action, but it's so wise to learn the accidents of history in the context. It's the easiest thing in the world to point out things that are wrong, but if you don't understand why, you're in danger of repeating the same failures. And I don't know about you, I've found, it's always PMs, isn't it, from an engineering perspective, but there's ultimately a deadline, there's a stakeholder, which means something needs to be pushed, a compromise needs to be made, it's not recorded, you don't pay the debt down, and given enough time, enough lack of attention, or enough desperation, or a lack of resources, those things don't always get fixed. I think it's fascinating how an organizational culture changes over time. Flagstone is now leased. Its engineering is about 10 times the size when I joined 5 years ago. And what you can do with that amount of resource means that previous things that are almost incomprehensible that at the time were just a pragmatic necessity.
Yeah, because when you're right, when I see it, and I've dealt with a lot of SaaS businesses, tech businesses that have got a legacy challenge, be like this one or different, but the people and the pain of it is always the same. There's often this, we want it, but we're not prepared to do what needs to be done to get it. What was that in this case?
Genuinely, that especially within the financial sector, and there are, many fintechs very much want to give the impression, hey, we've got amazing tech, we've got the financial domain expertise, it's all glued together. And of course, the space is littered with everybody who fails. So you know automatically that that's just not true. And the more we really admit it, that actually one of those things are going to be probably compromised because nobody can do it all. And so you tend to choose your battles. I think these are natural conclusions of the space as opposed to any kind of blame. I think it's all about what you do about it and how you prioritize it. And I think the most important thing is have a very pragmatic view. What was correct, a good stance even 6 months ago might not be relevant anymore. So just having that pragmatism and awareness and maturity that what's right now won't be right in the future. I think those are the ways that you actually start evolving.
Yeah, and I think there's another piece there that how does this frame with you that if you try and plan too much and read the future too much as well, you just end up in the same road in another place. Building that flexibility and the culture of the mindset of dealing with stuff is often the way, because things evolve again, don't they, with the cloud, with the technology and the business, and that all happens, creates many different facets. How do you see that? Because people see it as an end game in my mind.
I think you're absolutely right. Look, I very much am unaware and indeed enjoy the greyness of life. There's nothing that's black and white. And the idea that you can just throw something forward and say, here's a 3-month plan. I mean, there's no greater work in fiction than an engineering plan that's 3 years old. You're absolutely sure that those things won't remain. There is, however, a competing force, and that is with a rudderless ship will soon flounder. So without having just some milestones, some kind of guiding star, I think you're also in for a bit of trouble. So as ever, a balance, but really it's kind of pointless putting things too far forward. Just set the path and have a number of kind of muster points for everybody to aim for or collect around, and then at least you've got a way forward.
Yeah, I think there's a Churchill quote, isn't there? Only look as far forward as you can see, but do look forward, isn't it? Is I think the message. But if you get beyond that, so what was actually like the bones of it? So the business is growing. From my understanding, it's to do with like spreading risk and getting returns on investment in via a platform into different banking and accounts and investments that gives a level of protection for businesses and probably wealthy individuals. Is that a summary of what the business does?
Yeah, fair. We certainly are opening our markets and reducing our minimums. So it's really just you apply once to us and you have access to 60 different banks. It's as simple as that. And because of our relationship with the banks, we'll tend to get you a better interest rate as well. So that then balances the risk, etc. So the challenges within that space are multitude, not least of which because it turns out these are cash deposit platforms, right, where we aggregate accounts together, and there isn't really a manual because this is all very, very new out of deregulated bank industries and true fintech space, if you like. So there's challenges about that. I think look, sometimes when you start out, I think hiring is crucial. I wasn't there at that early parts in the business, but there are perhaps approaches to software, which is a bit more transactional script-like, or if you like, older ways of viewing things that are less domain rich and more specialized, which is how we might do things now. So some of it's history and perhaps just getting people who are less aware of best practice, but also within that time, the market and with the product market fit. That's not just about us finding our market, that's about us adapting what we do and how we do it. And so there are different even object operating models enshrined within the business. And all these things were also relatively unaware. The perspective, very few people in the business even understood those challenges that we had. So a lot of it was discovery and realization. Once these things are all made apparent, it's about finding the way through. And that's as much engineering and domain and also cross-business as to anything else.
Well, that touches, I might be making an assumption here, but I'm getting a feeling where, we see it this way, that the traditional way of software development, and then maybe what you mentioned there, where you're having to adapt, you've got to be agile because you've got a product market fit to find, you've got a growing, scaling platform that might unearth other issues. Have you moved more towards like a contained piece within the development and almost seeing those throwaway parts within that you can evolve things and fix rather than the old way of thinking, you've got the massive code base, you end up with the spaghetti, it just becomes too painful to get out of it. How does the software piece come in there of how you've tried to use the mentality of your architecture?
That's quite interesting. There's a kind of a storied kind of tale that's probably even too long for this. And as you can tell, I can go on at the drop of a hat. But this project itself built on top of the lessons that were already put in place. So we actually already had a replacement system deployed. That was a monolith that was developed at the height of microservices fashion, which was a fun sell. Yeah. But we were convinced that was right. That was proved out. And actually, it was only when that was successfully running billions of pounds already that we then started adding on the other modules that allowed us to the bridge. So once that was in place, then it was just about really bridging across all the other bits of the operating model that weren't there. So the rest of the build out, if you like. And then a number of approaches from how we took the process of taking all of our valuable customers and putting them over there in a way that didn't break everything. The fact that there are a number of mistakes we were determined not to make. If we'd have just re-implemented that, you'd have dragged all of the sins and the issues, of which there were many. So we had to decide on some business transformation at the time of migration. And as well as that, we were absolutely certain to write as little new code as possible. What we want to do is just reuse all the interfaces we have with some slight amendments, and then that way we can get as much reuse of our rich domain in the new system as possible. Those are the broad approaches. In terms of how we actually stepped through the problem space, the key part was, and there were many folkisms along the way, taking the big unmanageable boulder and kind of dropping it at the feet, smashing it, and throwing the small ones over, because it starts tipping and creating a momentum that in itself actually helps you. So we did that by stepping through a kind of terrace of complexity where we start with the easy stuff, build some confidence, and then steadily go up into the hard things. So each of those components really, I think, allowed us to do it.
Well, can we just dig a bit more, like in a deeper technical sense there? So you had the microservices piece. What is like the tech here? And I'm thinking database scalability, or you're using the services. When they grow out, they can end up being quite costly because it's hard to map that. You've got other tech that you've tried to hold on with minimal code changes, light refactoring. What did it actually look like in terms of what the tech was and what pieces you wanted to correct, what you ended up living with, and what you needed new and you did new on?
So we were quite determined to not go down the microservices route. There were some lessons before I was there where we had the typical microservices anti-pattern, which at the time, by the way, it was the height of the fashion, and there wasn't an immediate realization that it was quite toxic to have hundreds of services to orchestrate and control. That's why we actually went with a monolith at first, just one system, because we knew that we could actually deliberately break it out and just have a distributed system, which is where we're going right now. We might get to a dozen. Some of them are quite large, but it does give us some excellent kind of service boundary sizing, which means everything's much more predictable. So that's kind of a key thing that we definitely took.
So where you've built out, you've kept that core predictability, and then you can deal with one at a time, around the technical constraints of that, the cost, and anything else, and also the overhead of the management, and now it knocks on in other things you might do. Is that
am I
interpreting that right?
Absolutely. So I don't know about you, but when I've worked on microservices, when you're breaking things down into tiny segments, you get the sagas and the orchestration complications, because your rollback is really quite complicated when everything's made of 10 different compound parts, right? It's an explosion of complexity. We've gone for Goldilocks sizing, as we like to think. It might be a bit too large in places, but it does mean that it's much more predictable in that way.
Yeah, because you then create that other burden, don't you, where if you do get those problems, how do you roll back? What would that look like? Who needs to be involved in that? And just the sheer amount of time to redo things and get it up and get it back. It's just a timepiece then, isn't it?
Yeah, and trying to have your functional process not being too complicated. We are very pragmatic here, because frankly, we're not paid to have an academically perfect kind of system. We will prioritize anything that's about the total cost of ownership. And in many ways, that's almost like the punchline to migration, right? By keeping your total cost of operation down, it's better for everybody in terms of EBITDA, but frankly, it's just a much more pleasant system to work on by definition.
So what was the time frame and like the tech resource that was applied? So it sounds like you've got like there's code changes there, there's interface, there's a lot of transactions with the nature of what you're doing. There's a big security piece in there, I would think, and there's a lot of integration as well with these third parties. How did you group and understand that? Because that sounds quite a complicated, this is on the end of complicated with this type of work, in my view. Is that right?
The program, and I've worked on a few things, including the deregulation of the electricity industry back in the late 90s, and that was heavy, but this beat it all. And one of the reasons is the different combinations of stakeholders, both external and internal. So much less code-wise, but just the complexity of the actual program was kind of completely off the chart, and frankly, you had to compartmentalize each one and just try and take that off. But to get a bit more technical, we are a .NET kind of shop. We do our heavily API driven and DDD organized along some aggregates. And that really kept us honest. As I say, because we used the domain, that we were sure that once the data was in, it would be consistent. Of course, there's always asterisks around that. But the other thing we used was Power BI quite extensively. And a lot of the more innovative things were because the irony was that migration itself was a saga after saying for so long how much we hated sagas. And so what we actually did is almost made a machine. Also, anthropomorphization, if I could say it, of your services is very useful. So our migration worker was called Marvin, the migration machine. And what we did is enabled Marvin to firstly talk to each of the separate systems on our new platform. It would also eventually start listening to failures, and we also made it start radiating these things out, because when you're moving over 16,000 people, all with slightly different data requirements and length of transactions that can really complicate things, there's a lot of control needed in the whole operation. So it needed to be quite self-aware and able to kind of monitor itself, because it's quite a complicated process when you're throwing that many kind of clients and data items through that many different changes.
I would think Marvin sounds like almost a product in itself in this instance.
Yeah. But not only that, Marvin had a friend, Homer's Dashboard, which was just a crazy complex cohort analysis engine that allowed us to select and specify the clients that were migratable at that point of time. Even that in itself was very kind of feature rich in what was needed there.
So underneath all of this, it's bigger than I first thought. You know, when we first messaged about this, and you think, wow, there's quite a bit to that. What was the business's view to get behind this? Because it takes quite a bit of commitment, I think, in financial risk, time. This is pretty significant. So there must have been real reasons underneath that helped everybody point that we have to do this.
Honestly, Steve, that's a fantastic question. Not that the other ones weren't, but the lack of awareness of that, and indeed from an engineering perspective, and personally, that's probably been my greatest growth area. There's a whole lot of technical stuff that I could bore or interest you with, but I think a much more fascinating journey was how an engineer managed to get this change through this organization. Because the CTO kind of approached me, said, look, it's the biggest problem we've got, so you should look at it.
And is it because then the scalability of what you've got, predictability of the cost and delivery of that, and the reliability of that? I'm getting the feeling that it must have been those types of things that it would either constrain growth or it would potentially leave risk open in other ways, because that gets people's ears at that C level, I guess.
Risk and cost, as you know, you've certainly dealt with them. That certainly gets people's ears pricked up, along with growth opportunity and just cost of operating, right? So they were all there. But I genuinely think the biggest thing was the realization of, we had a lot of courage in doing this. And by the way, a lot of trust. Once we convinced the stakeholders, their commitment to us was second to none. And what that meant was that when we suggested, well, we've got 50 partners here, all with the same terms of business. If we just have a standard partner, we're going to save everything we do and make it cheaper going forward. And the really wonderful embracing part of it is that pretty much every recommendation got applied across the business, and some fundamental business changes happened because under analysis, we noticed it. So I think an open-mindedness can pay huge dividends.
What was the size of the team then that had to be involved to do this? The day-to-day practicalities that I can see the vision now. There's a driver from within the business on both sides of the fence, the non-tech and your tech team. And then there's all these other pieces around that, but then you've got to get going and get it all across the line. So the team you have to maintain something or evolve it isn't necessarily the team you'd need for this.
No, and indeed, even worse than that, often when you're asked, you don't always get all the resource you want. The core team was only about 10, and that covers PM, BAs, engineers, the lot. So that's an exceptionally skinny team for everything that team did. But we got beyond the storming and norming, right? We find a major kind of the odd data kind of hiccup that wasn't going to go through, or frankly cause a migration failure. We'd kind of bag and tag. We'd ensure they wouldn't be going through batch the next day. And then within a week, we'd have the kind of reconciliation process, the change, it's all gone through and they're valid to go again. So we got into a very smooth kind of situation. But beyond that, and I'm going to sound a bit like a broken record, there was such cooperation, there's such commitment by the rest of the company to help us in some cases where there wasn't a product kind of feature match, then we'd get a lot of help along the way.
Well, I thought you were going to say 20 or 30, because more than that and it had just become a bit of a nightmare. With that then, another interesting bit there is, were you all either contract or employed, tightly coupled to the business? Where were you geographically located? Because normally when I've seen teams do stuff like that, and we've got that our teams get smaller over the years, seems to, you can get so much more out of really good people in the right way than just throwing enough at it like people would have done maybe 15 years ago. So just talk to me a little bit about what that team looked like, where you worked together, how you worked together, and then why they were engaged in that way.
Well, that's a great question. If I could bottle that,
Yeah.
I would absolutely be a millionaire. Geographically, mostly UK, but kind of spread around the country a bit. We were remoting pre-COVID. We're hybrid, but only once or twice in the office. So broadly remote. A couple, there was one guy that's in Romania. What else? Yes, we've got the number of people. Now, most interesting really being the mix. We had about 5 or 6 engineers that swelled to about 7 or 8 max, about 3 or 4 BAs who were invaluable actually in really just liaising a lot more, and some really black belt kind of PMs and other staff engineers that kind of supported along the way. So there was quite a mix. What was interesting is that, as you might expect, as the technical challenges variously start getting solved, there's much more stress on the more customer support and kind of BA kind of roles where we needed much more specialist knowledge. So it was very fluid kind of makeup.
And were you lucky that you inherited most of those, or did you have to find a few?
Sorry, you did say about contract. So half a contract. Yeah. We got a couple of contractors. One guy in particular, Johnny Chan, who I'm a huge fan of. We just got good guys. Our CTO Lee, his network is extensive, and so he's got a really great kind of network of excellent engineers. So we brought some of those in. The rest were all permy. As for why they worked, I think you do have to. I'm still growing in my leadership journey, and I'm far away from the full article, but I am understanding the importance of those little milestones I was talking about, the story that gets you there, that how you actually bind the commitment to it, that you can actually convince people that, yeah, actually we can do this completely impossible thing, and if we all work together and work in this way, it will work. And it really stuck. And I think in some ways that terraced approach, that momentum, it was as much convincing for ourselves as well as for everybody else.
But yeah, and I think often, technical people are given, you can even get historically, the classes are written and it's fill in the dots, punch the keys, ones and twos in between the dots. And the more you can involve the bigger picture and let's see the why and the how and the what, and they're part of that, the more you'll get back out rather than just fill the gaps. But for that, you need good people that you can give that, I guess, autonomy to take on those decisions and do more themselves as well. And there's a whole balance there, isn't there?
Steve, we're massive on that. Culture is a huge part of what we do at Flagstone. So much so we used to just do a culture interview first, and you wouldn't get to the technical if you didn't pass that. And we consciously interview in a rather bizarre way. We don't have anything rote. We do have a PR and a set of questions, but the questions have quite a unique spin on them. We won't ask you for a whole load of principles. We'll ask for one that's more meaningful to you. And we listen, because we understand that most people are quite good at telling us what their experiences are. That can be difficult in very different neurodiverse situations and different cultural situations, but we try our best with that. But as I say, AI, the internet, and Stack Overflow, thanks, Jeff, tells us how to do things. What I want is the curious minds, the desire for craftsmanship, that TCO, right, that care. They're the things that are really going to help us progress.
You said the word just as it was coming in my mind then, Ian, that I was thinking, okay, the cultural bit, how you involve people, and there's a lot of noise, maybe too much in a way, about AI and where that takes the role of an engineer and developer. And there's tools that can complement there. There's people who say it changes. With what you're doing, I don't think it's going to change what you've done in the last 18 months immediately anyway. How do you see all that, just as a breakaway from what we're talking now? An off-piece topic there, AI in development.
I hope YouTube will scan it and you get your clicks for this. Look, you've been around this industry as long as I have, Steve, and you'll know about all the latest golden hammer fads, right? From XML everywhere to internet everywhere to Bitcoin everywhere. I am not saying that being able to generate new insight off of existing data sets doesn't have its uses. It's not going to solve everything. There's no doubt it's going to change the lower kind of more admin-y jobs, and I think we all as a society need to work out how we're going to help those people to contribute to society. definitely I find that interesting. People like ourselves are going to reap the benefits of AI because we have a lot of lessons and experience where being able to dictate certain agents is going to be hugely powerful. And so you're right. For things like what we just did, it'd be huge. Is it going to change everything? I don't think so. And part of it is, of course, that privacy duality, right? Are you really going to expose all of your IP out? Because if you do, literally anybody can outcompete you. So that's unwise. So I think in some ways, people are almost going to build up longer, bigger, thicker walls and just have very predetermined openings where they'll exchange information. So I think in that way.
I agree with you, because if you're at the lower level, the waterline will slowly increase up, but initially it maybe makes really good guys really, really, really good, because you can compound what you do by certain aspects of your role. You can make it more efficient and faster and just speed all that up, but your reach then grows. So maybe the best guys become more valuable, possibly even better paid, and there might become a gulf between that and those at the lower end. That's different. And then how do people make that transition? And I'm talking about early career or people still learning and coming through. And there's a lot more challenges with it than I see, but I can understand, in my limited way. But I do know that I've heard so many bandwagons since I've been in IT. It's what keeps the machine turning and the money flowing. It's the new latest and greatest.
I'm sure this is where all these social media influence got it from. No, they're all just used to be kind of technology influencers because they seem to have done it first. Everything that we were saying there just sounds like, and I'm a very visual thinker, so I can be guilty of that. The danger is that every kind of different level just keeps pulling the ladder up. And I think what's really interesting about that is everybody just thinks, if I pull the ladder up, I'm okay. Well, what do you think is going to happen next? Eventually, then the other people above that will keep on kind of producing a way of kind of templating everything that we do. That's probably going to come, but we just need to be aware of it.
Yeah, I think it's the great leveler in some ways, isn't it? Because the industry as I know it, I came in maybe in the early days was very much the Wild West in what you could do, and in some ways now anybody can do certain things quicker and faster than what stuff we got paid for many years ago. I won't bore you with the ins and outs. So, yeah, it's all there, but I think it's never as exactly as people imagine in the end, is it? But if we link back, then you've done something pretty special here, because most people fail on that type of stuff, in my experience. And that's not to be mean. It's probably 2 or 3 will bomb completely. There's 4 or 5 that pretend they succeed, and nobody gets it perfect. And there's 1 or 2 that really do get a result. And I'd categorize you guys in that. So what lessons have you taken from it, and where's it today, and what still didn't get done quite right?
It's all a bit raw. I've yet to write all the materials. I am actually going to have to write a book on it. I'll try and remember all the questions first. Lessons. Yeah. Definitely that twinned approach of the kind of that simplistic cohort level approach is huge, and that if you can have that determination to keep rolling forward as you're kind of solving things, and the resilience and the I guess confidence to do that, that is a hugely powerful kind of problem solving technique in even the most complex of problems. It almost sounds obvious, but it's kind of the antithesis, of course, of waterfall. It's almost kind of a crystallized agile, right? It's not just the fact that you go steady. It's like you will literally migrate as many as you can until the next day. And that's a very powerful concept because, of course, by its very nature, you're always improving. So I think that was a very powerful lesson. I think on a more sobering side.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt there, but we'll come back to the other ones. But I find that really interesting, because what I'd like to do there is just drill a bit more on that particular point. Are you saying that, in plain terms for people watching, you embraced the problems, you did as much as you can, and you didn't try for every eventuality? You had a way of working when the problem came that meant you could go around it, through it, over it, whatever, as quick as you can. And that meant you made that traction into it. I'm just trying to get
very much so.
Step here.
I can't go. I try and reduce down all the ridiculous amount of things going on, but it was a very difficult thing to predict. because of the very organic nature of both our business, certain data points, and different ways that people could come in. In many ways, at the start as we were growing, it was almost a desperation. If we could do business, then we would, but we tend to do it in about 12 different ways. Everything was okay and safe, and we had the checks at the outside, so you didn't quite know what was going to come out. So one of the first things as we started grasping this, and of course, this was, by the way, something, again, very pragmatic. We learned this and adapted as we went. And so as we found the early cohorts, they went, okay, they're nice and easy, aren't they, Steve? And as soon as things started getting a bit more involved, and that's when we realized very quickly we need to have the capability to retry, to analyze. And that's when we started going into this. The way that we fed in was crucial. We had an insane amount of data where somebody referred to it as complunk, which I still think is genius. You can put all the clients in the top, but there's so many different things going on, you're not quite sure what's going to come out at the end. So what we did is we built a way to actually analyze that set so that we could always find a safe set and keep going. It's a really important technique because if you can have that way of tackling something that is by definition nebulous, it's a way of getting through that. And we had a number of examples of apparently impossible problems that we just were a little bit cute about or a little bit patient about, and then we just found a way through.
Yeah. So what top 3 pains that you think, I don't like that, I wish I'd known this?
Maturities with banks have a surprising number of variability about them. Some might pay according to the Jewish bank holidays. Some might pay according to kind of US bank holidays. You've got different jurisdictions, sometimes different cultures followed by the bank. So as a result of that, working out maturities can be quite complicated. They actually worked out 136,000 maturities. So if we'd have been a bit cute about it and actually just double down, I know I said we used our existing interfaces. Well, we didn't always use all of our service code that we could have because we thought it would be quicker. And it's one of those that actually, after a while, we should have probably figured that one out. So we weren't always as smart as we could have been, I think, Steve.
And what else do you look then and think just general lessons, more maybe less technical for number 2?
Number 2, I would say, yes, this is a beautiful lesson that I when I say it, I still don't quite believe it. But I think as an engineer and somebody who hadn't led so much, it was quite a surprise. Some people just want to be there and say their bit. So it could be that. So sometimes we had, again, it was a program, many stakeholders, and we had a clear view on how something should be done. And we kind of suggested, stated, or discussed the fact that we could do this. And there was a whole suite of objections. Every stakeholder around the room stated the problem. And then we kind of repeated it. And then what we suddenly started realizing is nobody wants to change anything. They just wanted their opportunity. And when they come back, they can say, I said this. But nobody actually wants to change anything. They just want to make it recorded of what they thought. I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, I know that. AI isn't going to fix that one. But yeah, I think sometimes it's people need to be heard. Some people, I just want to turn up and get paid and not have that on me. So if I say that and you tell me to do it, it's on you. Because I just need to get paid and feed my family. And there's a whole host, and some are negative and some are just, no, well, I've never done it that way and all that. And there's a whole psychology around that is just way off here, isn't it? But yeah, it's an eye-opener. It's in some ways, it's quite a simple thing to explain. It's a very complicated thing to understand because it can be for many different reasons.
Certainly. Again, one of the tricks there is actually, do you know what? You don't need to understand sometimes. Maybe just keep going on. And that was and by the way, it can be dramatically simple in life, especially working life, when you just have one thing to do. I just had to do migration for 18 months. So all I needed to do is make sure that we were going forward. It was great. So certainly that for number 2.
Number 3.
Yeah, I knew you were going to ask that. I shouldn't have thought that quick enough. Let me think. I mean, having said that at the start about human and the context, etc., I do think that you do want certain things, I think, in your business. And I think most fintechs, especially newer fintechs coming around here, generally recognize this, that there are 2 ways to go about your business. You could start up, and by the way, this isn't how we started, but you could start up with just an Excel sheet that just adds and adds and adds and eventually becomes the cornerstone of your business. But you have to realize that all you're doing there that's not going to get you anywhere. Even if you go to get over this initial hump that you're obviously desperate to get out of, you're not going to get very far down the line. So you might as well kind of take a slightly more sensible view where possible. Of course, I am aware of just how hard that is, but yeah, a little bit of love and care there.
I think I'm thinking of all you've done, and this is maybe an interesting one for me as well. That I'm thinking you've done all this, and I know when I've had success with things like real highs, afterwards it can be a bit flat and you can get lows because you think, well, what do we do now? Do we just have to like ticker along, keep the lights on? What becomes next? Because if you've all been driven on something really good and then it's finished, people often look for the next thing.
Oh, yes, it's been awful for that, Steve. Yeah, slight impatience. What's absolutely fascinating, though, we created such a tight team. Those bonds aren't going anywhere, right? And it's not just me. The whole team has that spirit. And so in many ways, that culture is spread out, which is really powerful. There's also such a very acute focus on our domain right now. We are quite omnivisional in terms of where we are in our space and our client base now, which is extremely valuable. Personally, I'm finding it really tough. It was so much easier when I said, well, I had one thing to do. I've now got to find it. And it's that terrible thing, the higher and more leadership, the less concrete and immediate your results are. And sometimes they're really vague and nebulous. So it's this horrible fear that it's never quite working or never quite doing the right thing.
You realize it's fine sometimes just to do what needs doing, and you don't have to create the next thing, and you get that incremental, and that can be just as important to a business to get that consistency of ticking away as well as the big things, but the big things are a bit more exciting. So I know all about that. Often when you get to a good place you've always worked hard for, things become a little bit more mundane, but you work really hard to achieve that. And then when you get it, you think, oh, things are a little bit more mundane. But anyway, probably getting too deep there.
No, you're absolutely right. I'm finding that. Luckily now, there's quite a nice way to think about it, Steve. I had to work out personally extremely hard for that project, and what I've realised is that if I just work on force levering, building the foundations of an engineering organisation, I won't have to do that because there are many more hands doing the effort, right? So that's what is driving me now, and I think it's quite exciting.
Yeah, I think you were saying before, Ian, that you've got that leadership bit. It's not always about the technical, and it's maybe helping others in the team grow into that and do more of that themselves, and how you can take everybody forward with that in other ways. And maybe that's an interesting area. One becomes 10.
Very much so. That's exactly where we're at. It's that realization that as an IC you can only get so far, and ultimately you're gonna, if you're doing technical leadership, you're leading, and so immediately you have to have those skills and take an interest in those things.
Well, I've enjoyed the chat, and it's interesting to hear about a successful IT legacy transformation. I think they're quite a rare breed, a lot more than people maybe admit sometimes. So if you look back over those few years, what's one piece of advice you'd give people listening today who've got to take some software in the cloud and change it a lot because the business needs it?
Be very fixed on when you say the business needs to change it. Be very clear about the cost of what that means, and very clear on exactly what you want to change, and therefore the other things that don't change. That will be the key to it, I think.
So expectations and having that clear and that vision, both sides of that, where what's changing, what's not changing, what the cost of that is, and then people don't have amnesia down the road when it gets hard and you're in the trenches.
Exactly.
Yeah. Again, back to the people bit, aren't we?
My good friend Ian Kuby used to always say there's no such thing as a tech problem, they're all people.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good place to round out. Well, thanks for coming on today. I've had a look, but we were having a look at what you guys do, and there used to be something with Hargreaves Lansdown that was similar, but we've been through it today and we said this is actually a bit better. So I think you're onto something that's quite clear. I understood it straight away. There's some thinking in there I've applied. Yeah, it's I can see why you're doing well as a business.
That's great to hear. Thanks, Steve. Well, this has been an absolute pleasure.
No, thank you for coming on. Anyway, so all the best, and thank you for coming in today, Ian.
Pleasure.